Okay, hopefully everybody can see the full screen view. So tonight we're going to talk about from 1910 to 1974 because that's enough in one session. And then if people are interested, we can do from 74 to current, and it has about an equal amount of information in it. So let's start out with the very first. So in 1910 to 1912, the first patrol identification was actually bandanas. And it was interesting in that scouting, if you think about it, at that time was not very densely populated in the United States. You may have had one troop in a city or two. So it was more about what was going on within the troop, not between troops. So they needed a way to identify the patrol unit, because as we know, the core of scouting is based on the patrol. So neckerchiefs became the answer, or bandanas as they were called in those days, and National did not supply them. You went to your local dry goods dealer, picked out a color for your patrol, and then proceeded to wear them like a neckerchief. So every patrol could do their own color within the troop. You wore it knotted at the throat and knotted on each end. And most of the time you can see pictures of scouts like this where they're wearing the bandana. That is their patrol emblem up until 1912. Then something interesting started to happen, and that was more than one troop was in the same area. Well, as you get more boys and more troops and more patrols, you quickly run out of colors. So there had to be something new. So that's where we start to see the patrol knot appear. Now, the interesting thing here is the bandana did not disappear. So the bandana moved from being a patrol identifier to being a troop identifier. So now the whole troop chose a color and they wore it when they were interacting with other troops. So you could tell the troops apart. But America took notice of what was going on over in England. And England had these knots, as they called them, that they were wearing. So the US said, well, that's an interesting idea. Let's adopt it. So in 1912, and I'm going to let you guys read, this came out in Boy's Life. It describes the new knots and why the new knots are coming out. And there's a lot about these new knots, other than in addition to they're just knots and they're different colors and so forth. So let's talk about them. The very first knots, beginning that were referenced in 1913, were 6 inches long. Now think about that. That's a really long knot, okay? And the actual advertisement for them was in 1913 Boy's Life. It talks about a 6-inch knot made out of heavy braid. One of the most interesting things in the advertisement is notice what shoulder it gets worn on. It gets worn on the left shoulder, not the right shoulder, okay? Because in those days, the most important insignia of scouting was worn on the left sleeve. Your rank was worn on the left sleeve down at the wrist. A position badge was worn on the left sleeve. So when these came out, it was only natural that they be worn on the left sleeve. It was not until 1914 that they got moved over to the right sleeve. So let's take a look at what the difference is between our friends up in Canada and in England and the US, because a lot of people try to collect these and they end up collecting the wrong one if they're trying to collect the US ones. So in the US, the knots have 2 tacked outer edges. It's just whipped thread on the outer edges. And they have this brass metal loop thing, I don't know what else to call it, that you poke through your uniform and then bend the prongs back. The only problem with these is scouting discovered that when you clean your uniform, you take those on and you take those off. Even though they're brass and they're soft, they still, after a while, the prongs break. So when you find these in collections, you find a lot of them with broken prongs rather than nice elongated prongs. Now, the Canadian and the British one, the easiest way to tell it is most of theirs have a stitch all the way across, and they use a safety pin. The Americans never used a stitch one all the way across, nor did we use a safety pin one unless your prongs happened to break, and then you might have used a safety pin. But it should have either prongs or the whip stitches on them. So let's talk about size, because there's just not one size of these things. There's a 6-inch, there's a 5.5, there's a 5, there's a 4.5, and I'm betting there's every size in between, because these things were hand cut. But these are the official sizes. So in 1913, they talked about a 6-inch one. In 1914, in the handbook, they talked about 5.5 inches. And then that note around the night that's printed in the 1914 handbook actually appears all the way until 1925 in the handbooks. So it even makes it more confusing. In 1916, we now move to 5 inches in the official literature. And then you can see in 17, there's an announcement also about 5 inches with a metal clasp. Then in 1925, we reduced it to 4.5 inches. Okay. So it slowly got smaller. Now we can surmise some reasons why it got smaller. Let's think about scouting back then. A lot of activity outdoors, a lot of activity in the woods. If you're hiking through the woods or on an encampment, this thing that's 6 inches long or 5 inches long, braid that's dangling from your shirt, highly likely it's going to catch on something and potentially rip your shirt. The other thing that we've surmised, knowing West, is that if you go from 6 inches to 4.5 inches, that's 1.5 inches of material. We're betting that West didn't pay the same price as he reduced the size and length. So he was actually saving a little money. Now that's a supposition, but he was a miser, and if he could, instead of getting out of a length of this braid 10, he could get 12, then that made a big difference to them back then. Now, starting in 1926, because the shoulder knot was used all the way up in 29, the shoulder knot became optional. You could either use it or you could use other identification for your patrol. So how many of these things are there? Well, there's a lot. So the 6 inch, we know of 42. The 5, the 5.5, and the 4.5, we know of 50 titles each. And I've put on the screen here all the different color combinations and their names, and I've just given you a couple of samples of the different ones that are out there. We have found most of them as collecting, even the ones that are like, rattlesnake, which happens to be white and pink, or hawk, which is all pink. Those are known to exist. I'm sure it was kind of interesting wearing a pink ribbon on your uniform back in that time period. Now, something interesting happened in 1919. And this is not known to very many, but in 1919, the National Emblems Committee was presented with the idea of felt on felt as an alternative patrol identification, and they approved and adopted it. So this particular felt on felt patrol medallion, known as the Indian Chief, was actually used from 1920 to 1926. It is extremely rare, and I have documentation from the approval for from the National Badges Committee. So if you happen to see one of these little beauties, pick it up, and you can always call me because I'm looking for more of them. So this started something interesting, though. In 1919, when this was presented to National, they were really interested in the idea of an alternative to the patrol knot. So they released a statement that said that councils could produce their own insignia for patrol identification. It became what we call optional insignia for patrols. And here are some examples. These all came out of the Chicago area. And you can see that they are following the same color scheme. If you were to go back and look at the patrol knots, you would see that like we talked about, white and pink is rattlesnake, red, white, and blue is flying eagle, and so forth and so on. So many councils made their own. So you're liable to see in your collecting and travels in a traderie some felt on felt patrol medallions. They may not look like these, they may look like others, but they're from that 1921 to 1925 period. And there's some really interesting ones out there. National looked at this and said, well, that's kind of a great idea. Now you've got an emblem on the side of your shirt. It's not hooking, snagging, or doing anything, and it identifies really easy who you are, especially with these pictures of the animal. So they said, wow, let's adopt that. So they did. So they adopted these, except the Badges Committee created these 2-inch squares with different animal pictures. They're felt and they're screen printed. Now, on the far left is an example of what one really looks like. It's dark red with black. Now, the other ones, I've enhanced the contrast a little bit so you can actually see some of the images. But think about putting a 2-inch square on your uniform, dark red with black screen print, at the distance of about 3 feet. You probably can't tell anything other than it's a big red square patch. So these did not last long. They lasted from 1926 to 1927. There's 51 different designs, and only 29 of the designs have actually been found so far. And every once in a while, one pops up. This past year, the one that popped up was wood pigeon. Didn't know about it until it popped up on a uniform on eBay. So then we go from here, we move into the rounds. There's a lot of what is known as information about these rounds, and a lot of it is false. So for instance, people refer to these as felts. They're not felt, they're broadcloth. Okay, so broadcloth is made very differently than felt. And if you've ever looked at some of these really early patrol medallions, you'll notice in some cases that the fuzz is worn off and you can actually see what looks like fabric. That's broadcloth material. Because broadcloth is made in a way, and you can read it here, such that it ends up being kind of a felt-like surface, except it's not felt. So felt would not have lasted anywhere near what the broadcloth would last in the number of washings and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about the different kinds of these. The very first ones were silk embroidery. A lot of people call these black backs, but it's actually silk embroidery because West was very, very particular about uniform insignia. He insisted that everything be made out of silk thread. Even the patrol medallions are made out of silk thread on broadcloth. And you can tell these very simply because the backs look the same as the fronts in their design. Now, the way this embroidery is done is very different than embroidery we know today, because in this type of embroidery where the back and the front look the same, most of the time, if you know about a embroidery machine, the needle goes up and down in the cloth. The needle goes down, it hooks a thread at the bottom, then comes back up. In this type of embroidery, actually the cloth moves and the needle remains stationary. So the cloth moves through the needle and then back through the needle, and the thread is actually a continuous loop on the embroidery. So these are 1927 to 1933. There's 58 names in this. Then we go to the round broadcloth without the BSA, except they're not silk. They're cotton. Now, the interesting thing is we only know of 4 names in this embroidery style. We suspect that what West did was go to a second vendor and let them make some samples, make a run, because this uses what we call the traditional lock stitch, where the needle goes through the fabric, it locks underneath like in a regular sewing machine, and then comes back up. Most of these machines are known as Shifley embroidery machines. They're very high speed, and they would cut the cost dramatically. The problem is it's not silk thread, it's cotton thread. And West had this thing for silk. So we know 4 titles in this. There's a beaver, there's a frontiersman, a tiger, and a whippoorwill. And again, those are the only 4 titles that we've been able to find in this particular series. From here, there's also in this same time period, a sateen. Now, we don't know where this thing came from. We don't know what its origin is, but so far we've found one of them. It's fox, and it's on sateen material. It is the continuous loop embroidery, which puts it in the same time frame of 27 to 33, but we're not real sure. We're guessing about this one. And so far, we've only found the one title in sateen. Again, fox. So now we had all these emblems out there, but there was still in this time frame other competing organizations. And scouting was very particular about their badges being identified in a way that other organizations couldn't use them. So if you open a tunic or a pair of scouting pants from that time period, you'll notice that inside there's a whole bunch of scouting seals printed on the back of the cloth. In between those seals are black lines. That's not possible to do on the patrol medallions. So the Committee on Badges and Awards decided that putting a BSA on the front was the right thing to do, such that it would prevent other organizations from using them. And that's what created the first patrol medallions with the BSA. Now, you'll notice these first ones have a black back, just like the other ones I showed you. These are silk thread, okay? Again, because the back is a mirror image of the front. Then something interesting happened in 1939 in the world that affected scouting. So the conflict in Asia was starting to become rampant. At that particular time, the Boy Scouts of America sent a letter to every embroiderer they were using that said to them, you must immediately stop using silk thread and start to use cotton thread, because scouting did not want to be seen as promoting anything from Asia, which is where all the silk thread was coming from, which prompted the change to cotton thread in patrol medallions, as well as in ranks and merit badges and everything else. So the way we know it's cotton thread is you see the white threads in the back. That tells us it's cotton, not silk, because the silks are all black. So fortunately, at the time, because all the embroiderers were using these paper tape drives on their embroidery machines, they were able to use that same pattern essentially over on the Shifley machines that ran the cotton. So from here, things start to get interesting, because now they switch to twill in 1954. And we're not 100% sure of the date, but a lot of things happen right there in 1954. You know, community strips and unit numbers changed from khaki to red twill. So we suspect that's the right time that these patrol medallions changed. Now, the very first ones that came out with the twill had this white on the back. Now, a lot of people have referred to these over the years as gum back. They are not gum. In fact, Steve Moritz Embroidery, I had a great interview with him years ago. He was in the plant when these were made. He was a boy, and he talked about the application of the back, which at the time was Elmer's white glue. So they actually applied Elmer's white glue to the back of these badges. And here's what it looked like. Anybody know Krispy Kreme? So this is what Steve Moritz described to me as, instead of donuts going through, it was patrol medallions in sheets going under this stream of white glue that they then kept on going on a conveyor. And you can only imagine the mess of cleaning up at the end of the day or the shift or whatever, these machines that dispersed white glue onto the back of the patrol medallions. So in 1971, in an effort to get rid of the white glue, Moritz worked with a manufacturer of the cloth, and at the manufacturer of the cloth, they actually applied what appears to be a thin rubber film to give the cloth some body and stiffness, because you can see the embroidery is applied after the rubberized material or spray or whatever that was applied, because the embroidery sits on top of it. So that means that it was done at the manufacturer. And again, here, you know, the same 50 names seem to be strolling through on these. Then once we get past this, the next one is the same design using the same embroidery machines, except we switch to what are plastic backs. Now, the interesting thing about these plastic backs is, if you've ever been to a t-shirt shop where they take a plain t-shirt and then they grab the design you pick off the wall. They use one of these little machines like it's pictured here. They put the shirt on it, they put the design on it, then they'll put a thing that looks like figure B here, that's a silicone sheet over top of it. Then they'll close it and let it heat for a few minutes, and it applies the design to the t-shirt. They did the same thing with plastic. They took squares of patrol medallions, turned them upside down, put a sheet of plastic on them. Then they put this sheet of silicone, which has a weave pattern, a very large weave pattern, closed the clamp, let it sit, and it melted the plastic to the badge, which gives the plastic actually a little bit of a what we call a waffle pattern. It has the dimples and the hills and the valleys like a waffle. But this is how they were made at the factory. Each time that the person that was running the embroidery machine would get a square off of the embroidery machine, they'd turn around, put it under this, and put the plastic back on it. Very, very laborious process. The last version of the reds are these. This is a very interesting one in that in 1974, Moritz was still making them, and along with the Lion Brothers, but Moritz, being the chief here, was moving away from cut edge and going to the rolled edge, or the marrowed edge, as it's known. So they made a set of samples for National Supply with the rolled edge. They made 11 different titles. It has a paper kind of backing on them. And this was going to be the replacement of the cut edge patrol medallion, and make it have a nice marrowed edge and look crisp and neat on the uniform. At the same time this was happening, National was moving away from the traditional design that we all know and moved to color. They moved to color in the ranks, and then in 1974, they moved to the color in patrol medallions. So that's a little bit of history about patrol medallions in the early years. It's a lot to take in, I know. They're fun to collect if you got nothing else you want to collect. I'll put it that way. But on the other hand, if you've got your collection, your main collection, and you're looking for something interesting to do, you can pick up most of these for very little, and most of them you can get a handful of them for $10. But that's unless you're talking about the very first flashes, and those do go for a little bit more.